Hello and welcome, independent researchers, skeptics, and all of humankind, to Shadow Citizen.
Welcome to episode 12 with Tony Szamboti. You can listen to us live and chat with us at mixlr.com/Shadow Citizen. We're also simulcast at Radio Confluence, and from there you can take us with you on TuneIn and Zeno Live. My name is Rob O'Sell, and my co-host is
Rachel L. McIntosh. And today, I'm very, very pleased to have with us Tony Szamboti. And he is with the Architects and Engineers of 9/11 Truth. And I just, before the show, we were listening to some of the clips of 9/11. And I have to just say, my stomach sank thinking about 9/11. So I might break down in the middle of this whole thing. Tony, let me introduce him. He is a mechanical design engineer with over 30 years of structural design experience. And he's in the aerospace and communication industries. At one point in his career, he worked for RCA, the broadcast company, and it was the company that designed and built the antenna stack on the North Tower. Since 2006, he has authored or co-authored a number of technical papers on the WTC high-rise failures that are published in the Journal of 9/11 Studies and the International Journal of Protective Structures. And I really want to thank you for being with us, Tony. Thank you. And say hi to everybody. Thank you for being with us, Tony.
Oh, it's nice to be here, Rachel. And there's a big hello for your audience. I hope they get something out of it.
Yeah, me too. Now, listen, why don't we start this off with just a recap? Tell us, like, as if nobody knew what 9/11 was. Let's hear it from you. Just tell us what 9/11 was, when it happened, and then we'll roll into why 9/11, the Architects for 9/11 Truth, busted onto the scene.
Yeah. Well, everybody knows sort of what 9/11 was in the sense of the story, the official story that the government has given us is that 19 Arab hijackers hijacked 4 planes, airliners, I guess 2 from Boston, 1 from Newark, and 1 that came out of Newark, and 1 that came out of Dulles Airport in Washington, which is Reagan now. At any rate, and that they, 1 wound up crashing in a field in Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania, 1 hit the Pentagon, and 2 flew into the World Trade Center tower, the Twin Towers, both the South and North Tower. Mm-hmm. And, many of us accepted, the buildings collapsed. The planes, actually, they were doing 450 to 550 miles an hour and penetrated the buildings and did a good bit of structural damage. And the fuel started fires, ignited fires on multiple floors in the buildings. And then we all watched the buildings collapse, certainly people saw replays of the video of that.
Yeah, over and over and over. It was almost like it was like giving us post-traumatic stress, what they were doing to us on TV. Right. But go ahead.
So, I mean, this was a very traumatic thing. Close to 3,000 people were killed between the Pentagon, the plane that crashed in western Pennsylvania, and those in the planes and the buildings, the collapsed buildings in New York City. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that precipitated the war on terror that President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney pushed for. And I guess it was about 2006, some questions started coming up. And, there was a physics professor from Brigham Young University named Stephen Jones, a well-known physics professor. He had worked for the Department of Energy for 25 years as a physicist. So this was not a greenhorn or somebody given to wacky theories. That there's apparently molten metal, molten iron and steel in the rubble under the 2 Twin Towers. And I forgot to mention that in addition to 2 towers collapsing, there was a building that was 350 feet away from the closest tower. Right. It was known as World Trade Center Building 7. And it was across Vesey Street. There was a large street between the towers were in basically one city block, a 16-acre block, there were streets around it. And this building was not in that block. It was across the street from that block, and then 350 feet away from the closest tower, which was the North Tower, and the second tower to collapse. And it collapsed itself at 5:20 p.m. or 5:21 p.m. right around there, which was 7 hours after the second tower, the North Tower, collapsed. And there was also molten metal in its rubble, and either it was, I think, the USGS or NOAA or NASA, somebody flew a plane over 5 days later, September 16th, to look for hot spots because the firemen were having quite a bit of trouble. It was very hot. And it turned out that on the surface, temperatures were as high as, in a number of places, just under the buildings, were as high as 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit.
Holy moly, wow.
That's on the surface, okay? It was a thermal imaging thing they did. And so, at any rate, this professor in late 2005, he found out about this Building 7, and there was video of it. There was quite a bit of video of it.
Yeah.
And the way it comes down fully symmetrically, and it falls quite rapidly. And he felt it looked like controlled demolition. And then he's hearing about this molten metal in the rubble, and he theorized that it looks like this molten metal was due to the use of incendiaries, what they call thermite, which generates heat as high as 4,500 to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and steel melts at about 27 to 2,800 Fahrenheit. And if that was used, he felt that could bring the buildings down, and may have been used to keep the sound level down.
Tony, can I jump in right here?
Sure.
Yeah, I wanna just say too that I that's kind of the event that woke me up too was Professor Jones, because I'd been watching Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, and I was getting up to turn it off, and I heard, and up next, scholars will speak about 9/11 truth. And I go, what do you mean 9/11 truth? And I went and sat back down and watched it, and my jaw just, dropped. I was like, holy cow. And they didn't have any video or anything. I'm just listening to, Kevin Ryan, Stephen Jones. Kevin Ryan worked for Underwriters Laboratory, and he had submitted a paper saying that, no, we tested those beams. There's no way temperatures got hot enough to distort those beams. And so, there's all these people presenting all this evidence, and I'm kind of like, I was like everybody else. We've been brought up in this age of every car that goes through a fence and goes over the goes through space, hits the ground and bursts into flames. We're all brought up on TV, and here's the first event that was actually covered live, and we're watching it. So anyway, and it wasn't just Stephen Jones that thought that this was a controlled demolition. On that very day, here's Dan Rather. I'm going to play this clip real quick.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Now, the thing that's really interesting there is that pause. I didn't edit that at all. So they're showing the building collapse, and that was a 7-second pause for a 47 building to come down. So, Tony, explain to us why that seems so, improbable, to say the least.
Unusual, right? Improbable, unusual, incredible. Pick your word, like Dan Rather said himself. The building is 610 foot tall, 47 stories. Each story is about 13 foot tall, because, as you realize, in a building like that, they have a drop ceiling to cover the beams and girders and the plumbing and all the conduit up above the ceiling. So each floor was 13 feet tall times 47. It was 610 foot tall, or 611 foot tall. At any rate, it's quite large. I mean, if you look at a tower that's 600 foot tall, you're looking up, you're straining your neck back if you're right next to it. So this thing it was also, interestingly, it was also, each floor was an acre in size in both Twin Towers and Building 7. Building 7 was trapezoidal in shape. On the long side, it was like 330 feet. On the shorter side, 247. And then it was 144 foot wide. So similar to a football field, if you will, in length and width, very close to that. It had 82 very large columns, 24 in what they call a central core, where the elevators were and stairwells, and then there was beams and girders going out to 82 columns on the periphery, on the exterior. And it comes down all four corners start dropping simultaneously, okay, of this very large building. So that causes concern in the sense of where they tried to say this official story, which took 7 years to generate, says it came down by fire. There were fires in it.
And this official story, this is the NIST report?
The NIST wrote the report on World Trade Center Building 7, yes.
Yeah, okay.
They released it. Yeah, they released it in September. They first brought it out in August of 2008. That was a draft, and there was a press conference where some questions were asked, and then they released it in November of 2008. Well, during that press conference, it turns out a physics teacher from California named David Chandler had measured the fall of this building, measuring the corner using some computer software program named Tracker, and he determined that it was in full free fall acceleration. And what that means is it's at full gravitational acceleration, as if there's no resistance. It's like dropping your keys or a rock from your hand, 4 or 5 feet up in the air, where there's no resistance other than air resistance, which is very minimal. So if something's in full free fall gravitational acceleration, there can be no resistance, because as soon as you do any work, crushing or bending something, you're going to expend energy. All the potential energy has to be being converted to kinetic, which is energy in motion, in order to have full free fall acceleration. As soon as you do any work, you're taking some of the potential energy to do work. It's not available to become kinetic energy. So you can't have full free fall. You're going to slow down. Well, this was in full free fall acceleration for over 100 feet, which is about 8 stories. And he brought that up in that press conference that NIST had in August 2008. And they stumbled a little bit. And then they had to, when they went back to write the final report that was put out in November, they admitted to that free fall. They found out themselves that it was in free fall. Prior to that, they had said it was in 60% of free fall. It was 40% slower, but in fact, it was in full free fall. Unfortunately, they didn't explain it. They admitted it was in free fall, but they didn't explain it. And that's caused a number of us to say, wait a minute, how does this building go into free fall in a collapse that was allegedly due to fire? It's collapsing. All 4 corners of the roof go into full free fall acceleration, at the same time.
Right. And of course, before this ever happened, no building of this type of construction had ever fallen like that.
Due to fire.
By fire.
It gets better, yeah. It turns out, a number of people brought this up. Well, NIST even brought it up. The no steel-framed high-rise building. We're talking about a superstructure type building where columns are on top of columns. It's a grid going up. No building of that type of construction has ever completely collapsed due to fire. There's been a partial collapse here or there in a small area, but it's not like a big warehouse with one big roof. If that gets hot, it's just got thin trusses holding the roof up. They have collapsed in the past, but this isn't like that. These are massive columns, okay, that are going, where the columns are, have like 5-inch thick flanges, okay, lower down in the building. They're quite large, okay. It takes a lot of heat to heat them to the point of failure. I mean, tremendous amount of energy. And usually you don't have that much energy in an office fire.
Yeah.
So that's why they don't come down, because, in other words, it'd be like when you put something in your oven, it takes longer to cook, much longer to cook a 30-pound turkey than it does a 10-pound turkey, right? And everybody that cooks knows that. And the reason is there's thermal mass. It takes time to heat that mass to a specific temperature. We actually call that, there's a word for it called specific heat capacity. And it is the same for a given material. I think steel is something like 500 joules per kilogram per degree Celsius or centigrade or Kelvin. So you need that much heat to heat each kilogram, that much energy. And a joule is like 9 inch pounds. So just to give you a feel for energy there. And an inch pound is how much energy you'd need to raise 1 pound 1 inch. So each kilogram of steel, just to give you an idea, each kilogram of steel, if you have a beam, say 45 foot long, there's a beam they say fell that heated up to 500 degrees centigrade, and this beam weighs about 5,850 pounds.
No, that's kind of just another improbable thing right there, is that a single beam, the collapse of one beam, is what caused a chain reaction that brought the whole building down, and it brought it down into a symmetrical collapse. That's highly improbable.
Right. I'm going to get into that in a second.
Okay.
How the present official story claims this building collapsed. But I'm just trying to say the amount of energy required is enormous. And to heat that beam up, I'm just going to do a calculation real quick. I believe the specific heat of steel, I'm just going to look it up real quick, if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
Since we're on the radio, and I can do it on the computer real quick, but I think it's somewhere in 500 joules. I just want to make sure.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I'm not.
I want to make a comment about something. When you said something earlier, Rob, you said, "Oh, we were all watching this on live TV, and it was live, and there was a delay." And I just wanted to point out that what it was marked live, it was that footage was taken with a Westcam military grade camera. I worked for the company that made that camera, and that was flying around in an unmarked helicopter that day. And it just so happened to be right there to get that film, to be able to film that. And it force pushed that out to, it went to ABC 7. That was the first place that got that, ABC 7 in New York. And then that went force pushed out to CNN, Fox, and NBC, marked as live.
And so
there was a delay already.
And everybody was getting the same feed, and it was, now you're telling, and this is something new that I didn't know. And Tony, if you didn't know, Rachel, worked for a defense contractor, and they had prior knowledge, of Building 7. And well, Rachel, you explain it.
Well, this is one of those things. We had, we were trying to sell our division to whoever would take us. We were working with a company called Plan Graphics. And Plan Graphics, their big deal was that they had already mapped out all the buildings, most of the buildings in Manhattan. And we had called them into the office, and we had like a command and control center for a crisis situation, because we were selling a type of crisis software for emergency managers. And we brought them in, and they had blueprints. And one of the blueprints that they had was a Building 7. And I was asking the guys that were there, because it was such a big meeting. I mean, it was a ridiculously important meeting. And I set the meeting up with Plan Graphics, because I had actually met them at Drumthwacket, the governor's mansion in New Jersey. And they were looking to sell their business. So I was hoping our division would buy them, and I was trying to hook this all up. And meanwhile, little did I know, our CEO of our company was trying to sell our company. So we were all there together trying to work some sort of deal. I don't know. But so I saw the blueprints for Building 7, and this guy from Plan Graphics, we were just, chewing the fat before the big meeting. And, I'm trying to make conversation, and there's really nothing to talk about. So I said, what's going on with this? He goes, told me what building it was and what the things were. And I said, oh, what's this thing right here? And he was like, well, this right here is if this building has to come down, it would fall along this line. And he just run his finger down it like that. And I was like, oh, and at the time I wasn't thinking about any of this stuff. This was probably, I don't know, I want to say maybe a year, not even a year before September 11th, but it was definitely, I would say 9 months before.
Well, let's get back to our guest, Tony. Keep going. So,
Right. Well, I was trying to tell you this one beam, just a common beam in Building 7 where they said the failure occurred, a girder, I should say, was what they call a W33 by 130. So it was 33 inches deep and weighed 130 pounds per foot, linear foot. So I just want to show you that girder would weigh, it was 45 foot long, would weigh somewhere around 5,850 pounds. And to raise its temperature 1 degree centigrade, I just want to tell you how many foot-pounds that would take. It's 978,316 foot-pounds, okay? To raise its temperature 1 degree centigrade, all right? To raise its temperature to 600 degrees centigrade, you got to multiply that by 600. So, that's, or 580, I should say. So just to give you that number in foot-pounds, that is 567 million foot-pounds. And if I divide that by the 5850, I can tell you how high it's the amount of energy to raise that to a certain height. Okay.
And they're attributing this energy generation by office fires, correct? Just the furniture and carpet and stuff in the file cabinets, that all that stuff has been fireproofed.
Right. That's the amount of energy it would take to raise this 5,800 pound girder 97,000 feet in the air. To raise its temperature from room temperature to 600 degrees centigrade, where it loses about half its strength, is the same amount of energy as lifting that from the ground 97,000 feet in the air. That's how much energy.
That's incredible. So, man.
I'm just trying to give people a feel for how much energy is required to raise these massive amounts of structural steel to raise their temperature. It's enormous amounts of energy. There's not that much energy in the fire. The fire has a tremendous amount of energy. I'm not belittling that. I'm just saying it takes even a lot more. And then there's only enough fuel generally in office fires. NIST admits this. They burn out. They burn for anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes in a given area, and then they move. They burned out the fuel. Okay? Eventually it goes out. It's nowhere near a peak. I mean, it rises and then it falls. So that's the reason these buildings don't come down, because to get the steel to the temperatures required to cause it to fail, and that's also a function of what we call a factor of safety. And in these buildings, it was generally around 3. You need to heat them to where they lost 2/3 of their strength. They don't lose 2/3 of their strength to heat up around 700 degrees centigrade. So that's even more energy than I just told you that you would need to heat like a common girder like that, where they said the failure occurred. Now, to get to the failure, that the National Institute of Standards and Technology was given the task, and we're talking about this third building that fell at 5:20 afternoon, that was not hit by a plane. It fell after 5 p.m., okay, 7 hours later after the 2 towers. And they say it was done by fire, and it caught the eye of many of us because of the way it falls. It falls symmetrically, this very large building, and it falls in free fall acceleration. That's a dilemma.
Well, so that's another thing about this building, is it wasn't just a common, office building. This one was built pretty much extra stout because of all the agencies that were in there. And this is where Giuliani actually had his bunker for command and control of any sort of.
Yeah, well, we can talk about the IRS was in there, the Secret Service. CIA had a big office, the biggest office outside of Langley, Virginia. Biggest CIA office was in Building 7. There was also a very large Securities and Exchange Commission office there on the 12th and 13th floor, which is where they say the failure started, by the way. And where there were
figures, because that's where Enron's papers were.
Well, there are people that say the Enron California ripoff papers were there.
And WorldCom too is the other rumor. And
yeah, WorldCom and Citicorp, and there was. I think it's sufficient to say we don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The investigation has to determine this. There were very paper-intensive case files on a large number of suspicious transactions and business dealings in that building, and those cases were lost. So that's on the 12th and 13th floor, and that's where there were fires started on 10 floors. And it's very strange because there was no fires. There's no photographic evidence of any fires in this building until 12:15. And the North Tower, the second one to collapse at 10:28, which means it was an hour and 47 minutes before anybody noticed fire in this building after the second tower. It's also 350 feet away. And in order to have fires start from the collapse of the North Tower, which flaming items would have to fly 350 feet horizontally, break through the windows, and everything was in glass, and they were very heavy windows, and start fires on 10 floors. And in addition, adjacent to Building 7 was the U.S. Post Office building, and on the other side, the Verizon building. Neither one of them had fires. They had some damage, minor damage. Neither one of them had fires, only Building 7. So that's suspicious also.
Mm-hmm.
And this just says that the fires are started by the collapse of the North Tower. They don't investigate it. They don't talk to anybody. They just say that.
And they just happen to start on the floors where all the records are kept for the
right. And then on top of this, though, was Rudy Giuliani's command and control center.
Well, and he didn't use it that day.
And he wasn't there that day, which is interesting.
So this was before the towers came down. If nobody knew the towers are coming down, Rudy Giuliani did not go to his bunker, which he built on the 23rd floor.
Mm-hmm.
Very strange to build a bunker on the 23rd floor.
That's why one of the reason why we're with Plan Graphics, like I said, the company I worked for, we built command and control rooms, and we had this software that we would install, and we were putting in a proposal for that room. So I'm trying to think of the timeline of this. So it's got to be around that time when they were building that room.
Well, the late 90s is when that was done. When that Office of Emergency Management was erected, I believe. But whoever did that, interestingly, would have had access to the entire building for backup power and life systems for the Office of Emergency Management on the 23rd floor. And interestingly, it's right in the middle of the 47 stories. So
perfect.
So, and he didn't use it that day. And that was before the towers came down. So it's strange that he wouldn't use it. Whether they can say that they thought there was another plane was going to hit it. I don't know why they would necessarily believe that, but he did not use that building. And there's a lot of talk about it was on fire, though. They noticed fires in it at 12:15 a.m., an hour and 47 minutes after the North Tower came down. And the firefighters didn't fight the fire because an engineer from Rudy Giuliani's office said that the building was going to collapse in 4 hours or so. Nobody knows who this engineer is now. Well, that would be quite prescient. And NIST said that the collapse started in the northeast corner where these 5 beams that were framed into a girder pushed that girder past its seat at this large corner core column 79, and that girder fell off its seat, and then when it hit the next floor down, it broke through it, and there was a cascade of floors, and that column had 3 girders coming into it. The one girder was from the north, they said fell off its seat. The other 2 from the south and the west, they say their connections broke due to thermal expansion. They don't show the analysis for this. They won't give us that.
In your open letter to Dr. Bazant, if I got his name right, you talk about stiffeners being added to the beam that their report, the NIST report, says that those, it doesn't account for those stiffeners being there.
Right. Well, I'm going to get to that. So I just want to say what their failure mode is. They say this girder was pushed off its seat. It caused a cascade of 8 floors that left the column unsupported from the north. But the column, just like a corner column on the outside, only needs two beams coming into it. It needs lateral support every story. Otherwise, it gets too slender and it'll buckle under its own weight. But these columns can go several stories without any lateral support. But the common practice is to support them every story because you need to support the floors. But those beams coming into the column also keep it from getting spindly, okay, in a colloquial sense. It's too slender. So it's only about 6/10 of the axial load on the column that you need to support it with from the side every story. It's not a lot. The code says 2%, but you really only need about 6%. They're giving it like a factor of safety. At any rate, they say that these other girders coming into that, it was a corner core column. There's 24 columns in the core, central core. It was an interior column. And they say that these other connections broke over like 8 stories or so and left this column without lateral support for 8 or 9 stories, and that caused it to buckle. And then that caused starting in the northeast corner of the building, that caused a progression from north to south of the other columns, and then east to west, and that the whole interior came down, and then the exterior was left as a thin shell, and it buckled under its own weight. Now, when you watch this build, that's pretty hard to do that. Normally, when the interior starts going down, if you don't have lateral support for a large number of stories, those columns are going to start to buckle. And in the NIST report, when the east side, they show it starting on the east side in an animation, but the exterior columns start to buckle in at the top when they lose lateral support over 15, 20 stories. We don't see that in the actual collapse. We don't see what NIST is showing. And NIST stops their analysis, their animation after a couple seconds. So,
I was going to say, so Architects and Engineers, I heard they were going to actually build a model, like a total mock-up of Building 7.
They are doing a virtual model.
Virtual, okay.
Finite element analysis is being done at the University of Alaska as we speak.
Okay.
There was a contract let, and that's being done to investigate this.
Okay, so it's not a real. It's not like they're building a real building just to knock it down.
No,
this is virtual. It's in the computer.
Building, yeah, right.
Okay, all right. Okay.
That's what NIST did, but NIST won't release their data. NIST had contractors do this. They did some themselves in house, and they had a couple contractors that they work with. And anyway, the problem for them is when we got these drawings, the drawings were released to an Freedom of Information Act request about 3.5 years after the final report was released. And it turns out that they left pertinent structural features off of things in that initiation. Specifically, stiffeners on the end of that girder. They say that the girder, when the girder's web, a girder's like a beam, an I shape, when its web is past its seat, there was 65,000 pounds of load. There was 130,000 pounds on the girder totally. So on each end, it would be 65,000 pounds. And the girder seat was about 7/8 of an inch thick. It was 11.5 inch wide girder. The flange was that it's sitting on the seat, but it's got the central web, which is taking the load. When that went past, the central web went past the seat, the 12-inch wide seat it was sitting on, if it was pushed 6 inches or so, all that load would be on the 7/8 thick flange, which, has some width, but it's relatively thin, right? And that would fold up and bend and fall. What they left off was stiffeners, 18-inch high stiffeners that were 3/4 thick that came out all the way from the web out to the flange at the end of the beam or girder where it was sitting on the seat. Well, that stiffens that flange that makes it like 89 times stronger. Okay, and the amount of it was under strength to fail by about 2 or 3 to 1. Well, 89 times stronger is a lot more than 2 or 3. It wouldn't fail. When you do the stress analysis with the stiffeners in there, it's way beyond. It's far away from failing.
So something's wrong with that. For that thing to happen, it would be that stiffener thing. It would have to be. The
stiffener would stop it from happening. So what they're saying happened couldn't possibly happen if they had the right parts on there. They left them off of their analysis. We found out later when we got the drawings, and they were confronted about this. Okay, and they didn't answer at first. It took them 19 months to come back and admit they left the stiffeners off, and they said because their analysis showed they weren't needed. because they were.
Well, in just by chance, in the unlikely event that particular girder was placed on Monday morning, and someone happened to forget the stiffeners, they certainly didn't forget them on all the core columns and all the beams in the rest of the building.
No. Well, those stiffeners weren't on everything. In fairness, Rob.
Okay.
They were in certain situations. That particular girder that they say failed. This is a critical part of their hypothesis because the beams are framing into it from one side, so it can push it, it can push it away. But they left the stiffeners off of there, and you can see those stiffeners on that particular girder in pictures. They're there, okay? They left it off, and they're on the drawings. They left it out of their analysis. In other words, it's like I'm taking things off the analysis to prove something would fail that wouldn't if I had left those things included. Well, you're not supposed to do that. You're certainly not supposed to.
They made a report that made it go along with the quote unquote official story that they've told us on TV.
And they had to fudge it to do that.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to get at. They had to fudge things to get it to go the way they wanted. And there's other things that are wrong with their story too. Besides that,
now you wrote this letter, questioning these things that appear to be admitted, whether on purpose or not. But how long ago did you write this letter, and did you ever get a response to it?
What are you talking about? Letters to NIST?
No, the letter to the Dr. Bazant that you opened.
Well, he wasn't involved in Building 7. He only talks about the towers.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
That only concerns the towers. The NIST several letters are written to NIST by different people, different engineers and others. So
did they respond? Did they respond, Tony?
They did eventually, yeah. Yeah, they did. And they said they left the stiffeners off because their analysis said that they were for web crippling. That's buckling of the web. And they weren't needed. Their analysis showed there would be no web crippling. Well, they also stiffen the flange. Okay, it's sort of like, I have a bracket coming off the wall that's holding up the shelf. It holds up the shelf, but it also stiffens the wall, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. And they left them off. And the flange would not break if those stiffeners were there. Well, there's another problem too, okay? Because the column, they say that the girder was pushed, that framed into, that the seat was on, that column had what they call build-up plates. If you can imagine an I-shaped column and you take side plates and put them against the open part where the flanges are, that's called a build-up column. That's what column 79 was. So it was like a box column with a web in the center because you took these side plates and enclosed it. And those side plates protruded about 1.8 inches. And this girder, when it expanded, would have been up against the column. And when it was pushed to the west, would have gotten trapped behind that side plate. Okay, they completely ignore that. So, and there was another outfit named ARUP, ARUP Engineering, there was a lawsuit on this between Aegis Insurance Company and the Con Edison. There was an electrical substation on the first two floors of Building 7 on its south, I guess it's north side. Mm-hmm. It essentially was the first two floors of the building on the back side. And they filed suit against Silverstein or WTC7 Properties and the engineer Cantor Engineering. And that suit went to the U.S. District Court in Manhattan and then the Circuit Court of Appeals. And it was finally decided in, I think, December of 2014. And they just threw it out saying they tried to say the building was designed negligently. And the court threw it out. Well, what do you expect? It was 9/11. It was silly. And there was a dissent. The one judge said, we want to know how the building came down, but they never did get to that. And in that analysis, they put those stiffeners in there. They also showed that girder could not be pushed past those side plates on the column. So they basically nullified the NIST's report. But many people don't know about that.
Well, you brought up a name that's also interesting. Larry Silverstein had leased these properties. What was it? It was less than a half year. It was 4 or 5.
Okay, all right. Well, you're getting into the towers now. We're talking about this third building right now.
Okay,
That's
and
building 7.
we've got 20 minutes left, so maybe we should
Okay,
switch
all right.
gears
Well, now
a
we
little
can shift to the towers.
Okay.
So what I'm going to say, I'm going to wrap up with building 7. There are many questions of building 7. It's in free fall acceleration. The NIST initiation hypothesis is provably false. Provably false. People need to know that. And that's not because I want to say that. The engineering, they leave parts out that would stop the failures they allege occurred. So it's provably false. So we have this third building that comes down in what certainly appears to be a full controlled demolition. It's coming down in free fall, the entire building, all 4 corners simultaneously for over 100 feet in free fall. That can only happen in a controlled demolition. You can't get that naturally. And then the National Institute of Standards and Technology's report, I'm going to say, is essentially fraudulent because it leaves parts out that would stop the failures that they say occurred.
Well,
okay, I have
to
ask. Wait, Rob. You said, wait a second. The towers have to do with Silverstein.
Okay, we're going to get to.
But wait a second. But did Silverstein have anything to do with Building 7 though?
Silverstein owned Building 7 outright. Now, in 2001, he acquired the Twin Towers. He leased them for 99 years from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for $115 million a year in 2001. In July of 2001, he insured them against terrorism because you had the 93 bombing. I mean, that was legitimate, but he insured them for $3.2 billion. And after it happened, after 9/11, he tried to claim it was 2 different terrorist attacks and get double that $3.2 billion. So he wound up getting something like $860 million for Building 7. He got a $3.2 billion for the towers, and then he got $4.55 billion for the towers total. So he got a partial. He didn't get full double indemnity, but he got more than 1 times the $3.2 billion for the towers.
And I'm going to jump in right now because I have that clip that I'm sure you've heard 100 times, but I'm going to play it one more time. It's Larry Silverstein saying that we made the decision because you talked about prior knowledge. They seemed to know that Building 7 was going to come down before it did.
Right.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Hey, listen, what I was going to do is pull. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
And then with all the citizen journalists that are out there, we have, uncovered several clips of firefighters and that, before the building comes down, talking about it about to come down. So I got a few of those that are compressed together here.
You hear that? Keep your eye on that building as they coming down. Building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. The flame, debris coming down.
So we've got people that are talking about, an event before it is initiated, and we have now, architects and engineers such as yourself that can do the real hard math and say that, the explanation they gave for the collapse of Building 7 is completely unrealistic. It's just, it couldn't happen that way. Anyway, Now let's go over to the Twin Towers and the time that we have left.
I just want to mention one more quick thing about Building 7. They can't even, when you do the math, you can't even break through the next floor down, even if that girder did come off its seat, and that's provable. But now let's go to the towers. Larry Silverstein, the owner of Building 7, the building that came down in a funny way we don't know for sure how the fire started in it, and it certainly came down in a funny way, and they're trying to say it was fire. So it looks like a controlled demolition. They don't want to admit that, and the report can't show it came down by fire. Nobody's shown plausibly how that could come down by fire. So we're asking big questions about that. Now, as far as the towers are concerned, Silverstein, like I said, he leased them for 99 years at $115 million a year from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in 2001, insured them against terrorism, and collected on that afterwards. And of course, we have the new One World Trade Center built there now and some other buildings. The towers were hit with aircraft, and about 15% of the columns were destroyed or severed, severely damaged or severed. Those towers had a 47 column central core, very stout, very large columns. That core the buildings were 207 feet on a side. Each floor was an acre, a little over 40,000 square feet. An acre is about 43,000 square feet. They were between 42 and 40. An acre is 209 feet on a side. The buildings at the bottom were that, and then they transitioned from larger columns, 10 feet apart, to 14-inch box columns, 59 on a side, 40 inches on center. And then when they transitioned, they got a foot on each side smaller, so that they were 207 foot square, those buildings. And like I said, the aircraft, you can prove that the wings could never get to the central core, which was about 135 by 85. It was a rectangular core with 47 columns, essentially 6 rows of 8. One row had 7 columns. It was 47 columns. The wings, when they went through the exterior, which were 14-inch box columns, 40 inches on center, also they hit multiple floors. So if you can imagine, the floors are going in horizontally and the wings were angled up. They would be going through those floors through their stiffness. And the impact on the North Tower is 60 feet from the core. The wings never got to the core. So now you have there were 767-200 ER aircraft, extended range aircraft. They had a 7,700 mile range. They were going from Boston to the West Coast. We know they were fueled with about 10,000 gallons. They wouldn't fuel them maximally because that's a waste of, you have to haul that weight around too. So they fuel them with a little bit of margin and enough to get to where they're going.
A thing to note about the fuel here is most of that fuel that was on the planes would have been burnt up in that initial fireball.
That's right. That's right. At least half of it. You could easily say half of it. The fireballs were quite large. And like I said, the wings would not have gotten to the core, but they ignited fires. But if you take the fuselage of the aircraft was 16.5 feet in diameter. One can imagine you have this grid of steel. Every 40 inches, you have one of these 14-inch box columns on the exterior. Then you have these floors, and then they were bolted. They fastened up to the central core of another 47. They were large columns. You could run that, even if that 16.5 foot diameter fuselage was solid steel, run it all the way through this 207 foot on a side building. And think about it. You put a 20-foot hole through the building. Would you expect it to collapse? I wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't either. And you make a real good point about the floors being on the edge. Now, those floors are like box pans that kind of take.
Well, there's pans. They're 4.5 inches deep of concrete, and there's quarter inch, like 1564, so a little under quarter inch diameter rebar in a 4-inch by 10-inch grid. 2 layers of that in those floors. You're not breaking them up real easy. And it was high tensile strength steel rebar in the floors. They call it welded wire fabric, but it's quarter-inch diameter, 90,000 psi steel.
So imagine aluminum passing through, that kind of rebar embedded in concrete. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, so the wings never got to the central core of the building is what I'm saying. They put the hole on the outside, but they didn't do a lot of damage to the internal columns is what a lot of people don't realize. There wasn't just floors in between the exterior. There was this huge structure in the center that all the elevators and stairwells ran through. Okay, it was called the central core. It was like a building within a building, okay? So
and once again, how much the height between floors? What was that in the towers?
In the towers, it was 12 foot.
And so you've got a fuselage that's is 16 feet in diameter, and it's got to squeeze through, and all the strength of the airplane is in the skin and the outside of it because it's a hollow tube.
The keel, an aircraft fuselage has a pretty strong keel, but that's below the floor. So that's
still it's going to have to slide exactly in between 2 floors. It's going to have to hit exactly in between 2 floors in order to make any sort of egress into the building at all. So,
well, it's right. That's right. Well, it hit between the 95th and 96th floor. I'm talking about the North Tower, the first one to be hit. It hit right on the north face. But interestingly, NIST says that's not what caused the collapse. They say that fires on the south side, the opposite side of the impact, is where it started, because they say the trusses, they were double trusses, 32 inches deep, quite stout under the floors between the exterior and interior columns, the core columns, that they had their fireproofing knocked off all the way on the other side of the building, okay, from where the plane hit. That's very unlikely, and their own analysis shows it's unlikely, because they show the speed of the plane and the speed of the debris in milliseconds. They have steps, and they did a fireproofing. They did a test at a large, like, plywood box that was open. They put steel in there and sprayed it with the fireproof, spray-on fireproofing, and they fired a shotgun at 500 feet per second at it. Well, of course, it took it off. Well, there was a misfire, and this is in the report, and it's slowed down to somewhere around 30 feet per second, and none of the fireproofing was ripped off. And they shot out of the shotgun like nails and nuts and, you know, different pieces of steel, all kind of little steel parts. And when in the misfire, where it slowed down to like 30 feet per second or something like that, 50 feet per second, none of the spray-on fireproofing was knocked off the steel. Well, NIST shows in their analysis the aircraft debris, by the time it gets to the other side of the building, it's well below, it's like half the speed of what I'm talking about in that misfire. So it wouldn't have the speed to knock the stuff off. And that's what they say, because that was knocked off. The fire heated up these trusses. It pulled in the exterior on the south side, the opposite side of the impact. That caused that wall to buckle, and then the whole thing propagated. They don't talk about the propagation, the horizontal propagation. They say once that south face buckled, the exterior, it was inevitable. And this stops their analysis there. That's where Dr. Bazant from Northwestern University, civil engineering professor, he put out a paper 2 days after 9/11 saying how the buildings collapsed, because once it started, but he only gets into the vertical propagation. He skips the horizontal propagation too. And this is important, because they're saying the south wall buckled. This is the opposite side that the aircraft impacted, okay? Mm-hmm. And because these trusses got hot, because their fireproofing was knocked off and pulled in that wall. But they don't talk about the propagation across the entire horizontal, across the 98th floor, they say it happened. That happens across that entire building in less than a second. I want you to think about this. It's a 207-foot square building. The diagonal from the southwest corner to the northeast is just under 300 feet. Those two corners start moving within 0.7 of a second of each other downward.
No,
I'll eat my hat if that's due to fire.
We've got 7 minutes left, actually 6.5. And you did you actually work on the radio tower? Because in one of the videos, you can actually see the top of the tower with the radio tower on it starting to tip over to the side, and then it collapses through the path of greatest resistance.
It comes down first. The core was taken out. The core failed first, and the TV antenna tower is what it is. There's probably radio antennas on there also. That's a stack. It was 360 foot tall and 353 tons. That was done here near where I live. And why I live here, I live in Blackwood, New Jersey. I worked at RCA Broadcast, which was in Voorhees at the time. It's up in Maine now. What used to be RCA Broadcast. They designed and built those antennas for TV stations. That was done before my time. I worked there in the early 90s. That was done in the late 70s. But I did design those type antennas. At any rate, and it was a structural design. That's when I say aerospace and communications industry. I designed some heavy antennas. I've mostly worked in aerospace, except for some antenna work in the communications industry over the years.
Can I ask a question,
sure,
since we're kind of wrapping up here? If by some miracle, all of a sudden, people realize this NIST paper is just total crap. All of a sudden, they just said, wow, this isn't even right. And if by some miracle, they said, okay, this paper that 9/11 engineers truth did, that's wonderful. What would happen? Like, what would be the chain of events that would happen if all of a sudden they realized, oh my gosh, somebody did put, now there's, what would be the first thing that would happen?
Well, you have to go after people that committed the crime, Rachel.
But who did it?
It wasn't the aircraft. I can't tell you.
That's what I mean. Who did it?
Well, they've never, and we know there was charges, and there had to be charges in the building. None of these 3 buildings came down due to the aircraft. Building 7 wasn't hit by an aircraft. It comes down in free fall, and the report is non-explanatory. They leave things out. They don't explain it. The towers, they don't explain either. Those reports don't consider the horizontal propagation, and they get to Dr. Bazant, and he says it's inevitable, and here's why the columns would. He overestimates the speed of the falling upper section. He underestimates the column strength below it, and he overestimates the mass. He uses the max.
So all those people like this doctor that you're talking about, NIST, would they be part of the plot?
Well, I think they're covering up.
Yeah. Would they get in trouble
they're
too?
Helping to cover up. Well, they're going to have to answer for things. Yeah.
Yeah. This is huge. This is really big. And there's a lot of people involved in this. And I don't care if people say, oh, it's a conspiracy, but it's like there's a lot of people involved in this.
Well, they're covering up how the buildings really came down. Now, if there's charges in them, they never investigate anybody that had access to the interiors. That's something you could do right away. You start an investigation, you would want to interrogate people that had access to those interiors. I'm not talking about office workers. I'm talking about maintenance workers, contractors, people like that. Okay?
They never did that? They never did that?
That has never been done. No.
Oh, what the heck?
Exactly what one would expect one to say. They never did that, no. And you can see very focused ejections on the corners of the North Tower. There's a video called The North Tower Exploding. Look at the corners. You can see these jets coming out very close together on either side of the corner. That's where the beams from the walls bolt up to the corner. Mm-hmm. And when you want to take something down like that, you don't want it to be stiffened by the 90-degree wall. So you cut them. It's just like a beer box. Remember the old beer cartons? They were very robust. If you just pushed on them with your feet when you were a kid, it would be hard. But if you cut the corner, they would just flap over. See what I'm saying? The corners look like they were cut, and the walls just pedaled outward like a flower. The exterior has the interior stuff pushed down on it. You know the core failed first. There's no way that would happen. They don't talk about this horizontal propagation. It's pretty hard to make that happen across a 300-foot diagonal building in less than a second.
Without really going into the engineering, we also see videos of these huge, massive grid structures, from the exterior of the building being ejected some 600 feet and being sticking into other buildings. So if it was a straight down collapse,
I don't even go with that. I just talk about you can't. The engineering explanations we've gotten aren't good. I think the squibs coming out in the video are very good evidence of charges.
Okay, and we've got a minute and a half, and so you're a member of AE911truth.org, I believe, and I'm a signatory as a handyman.
That's good. Everybody needs to support that group with just a small amount each month. If we can all do that, a couple dollars a month.
You've done billboard campaigns. You did a 3 skylight, which I thought was just brilliant. You had 3 skylights shining into the sky on one anniversary, indicating that 3 buildings came down because nobody talks about the 3rd building. So great. Well,
something even more important right now is that we wrote a paper last summer called 15 Years Later, and then it says there's a colon, 15 years later on the physics of high-rise building collapses. It was printed in the European Europhysics News, which is the magazine of the European Physical Society. It's just like Physics Today is the magazine of the American Physical Society. That's the European Physics Society. Again, it's 15 years later on the physics of high-rise building collapses. It's a 6-page article, 3,000-word article. I suggest everybody read that, and you'll get all these details. Just
Tony, we really appreciate you coming on. We're out of time, so we got to go out with our music. Thanks bunch, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. You rock.
Welcome to Shadow Citizen with Rachel McIntosh and Rob O'Sell.